Thank you all for coming out today. This is, I think, our fourth cemetery tour
Yeah, it
we've
is
done
actually.
with having people come out. So very nice to have all of you. This October will be 3 years that Matt and I have been doing the podcast together, and we did one video where we came just the two of us, and kind of I think a year and a half ago or so, and talked about the cemetery. So. I'm sure some of that will be covered, but if not, it is another really interesting video with a lot of good information on our YouTube video, or on our YouTube channel, so you can check that out. Our next tour is going to be at St. John's, and we're doing it in time to do talk about veterans and have it out for Veterans Day. So keep that in mind. Really have grown off of what Matt's done over his lifetime of learning about Mokena and its history. And this place is especially special to all that. So with that, Matt, please take it away.
All right. I think just about all of you know me. That's a first for one of our tours. But if you don't, Matt Galick, lifelong resident of Mokena, have been studying the history of Mokena for, about 28 years now, ever since I was in 7th grade. Author of 2 books on the history of Mokena, dozens of articles in the old Mokena Messenger, in my old column about the history of Mokena, have my blog, Matt's Old Mokena, all kinds of good stuff. Been with Israel, as we were saying, for a few years. But this really is a great place, and I'm so glad we're here today to talk about it, because Pioneer Memorial Cemetery is the oldest landmark in Mokena. As things stand now, there is not one house or building in the town that is as old as this cemetery. When the ground was very first broken here, this was a simple rise on a wilderness prairie with only a handful of the primitive log cabins of our founding families nearby, as well as Wolf Road. Wolf Road was here, but at the time it was just a narrow Potawatomi trail. Well, the history of this cemetery and the 2 others in town do overlap at a certain point. The start of this place was decades before theirs. There are, and some of us were already talking about this a little bit before the tour, but there are some common misconceptions about this place that have circulated in town over the years that I feel like I should address. The first being that this is strictly a veterans cemetery, which is not the case. There are indeed some veterans that are buried here, but the majority of people who found their last resting place here are civilians with no military background. Second, there is a weird idea that has gone around in very high circles in this town even, that this is not a cemetery and that there is nobody actually buried here. This is also inaccurate. There are at least 35 souls who have found their last resting place here, but the tally is likely much higher for reasons that we'll get to a little later. But for those of you who have been on my other tours, this one will be a little different. We can't really talk at length about the individual people like we've done on some of the other tours, because the information and the details just aren't there. It's going too far back. So most of them we could only do in broad strokes, but nevertheless, there's some pretty cool stories. So the first known burial to have occurred here at this cemetery on these hallowed grounds was that of a gentleman by the name of Charles Denny, who passed away in August of 1839 at the age of 79, at which point the Mokena area had only been settled by Americans of European descent for only about 8 years at that point. He has a huge claim to fame, which we'll dive into in just a few minutes. The last known burial was of a gentleman by the name of Albert Abrahamson, who was a farmhand in his 30s, who froze to death near Tinley Park in January of 1897. He seems to have been buried here by charity by the German United Evangelical St. John's Church of Mokena. So, to talk about the history of these grounds, we have to talk about the man who founded it, who started this cemetery. And this gentleman, this proprietor, for the first few years, or excuse me, first few decades of this cemetery's existence was Alan Denny, the son of the aforementioned Charles. And at least 7 of his family members are here, including his parents and his brother. And he has gone down in the history of our village as the founder of Mokena and has had quite an interesting life. He's kind of like, I like to compare him to the George Washington of Mokena. So Alan Denny was born the day after Christmas, 1790, not far from Albany, New York. And he was the oldest of 10 brothers and sisters. As a young man, Alan fought the British with the New York militia in the War of 1812, the now tragically mostly forgotten conflict where Washington, D.C. was sacked, the White House burnt down, and our national anthem was born. After the war, he went into storekeeping in Chautauqua County, New York, which is in the westernmost part of the state on Lake Erie. And soon he became a strict adherent of something called, that was back then was called the temperance movement, which was around in American history for a very long time, which saw alcohol, spirits, as basically the cause of all of society's problems. And at once he stopped or refused to sell ardent spirits in his store anymore after that point. And sometime before 1820, he married Lucy Herrick, and they had at least 3 children together, 2 of which lived to adulthood. Life changed in 1834, though, for the Denny family, for it was in that year that they packed up all their stuff in New York and moved to Illinois and settled on the site where Mokena now stands. At that point in time, none of us would have recognized anything that was here, as it was raw prairie and timberland, especially around Hickory Creek, which at that point only a few, the tiniest number of other settlers had begun or started to cultivate. As the years carried on, Alan Denny would buy large tracts of land from the federal government as it came on the market bit by bit, and that is where our community now exists. Where exactly the Denny family lived and where that corresponds to today is kind of a mystery, but it is known, I've been able to determine that eventually Alan Denny kept a homestead on LaPorte Road in the vicinity of today's Scott Street. Tragically, Denny lost his wife Lucy in 1844 and soon thereafter remarried to Polly Marshall, an area widow. If you were on my Marshall Cemetery tour, we talked all about Polly there, got to meet her there. A huge part of Alan Denny's life, besides the temperance movement, was abolition, or the dismantling of slavery. Abolitionists, as they were called, were considered radicals by a lot of the people in their time. And Alan Denny, this is not hearsay, this is a verified historical fact, kept what was called a station here in Mokena on the famed Underground Railroad in the years leading up to the Civil War, and ushered untold number of former slaves on their way to freedom in the North. And don't forget that even though we didn't have slavery here in this part of Illinois, it was still illegal to help runaway slaves. So Alan Denny was really putting his neck on the line by doing this. And he even got in trouble once for it and was indicted under fugitive slave laws, but unfortunately it was never really recorded what came of this. So we don't know if he had to pay a fine or if he even went to jail or if he got off scot-free. We just don't know. But what really sealed Alan Denny into our history was what happened in 1852. At the time, he's 62 years old. In that year, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad was built through our neck of the woods. And at the time the first rails were laid, Denny subdivided some of his property around the tracks and named it Mokena. And thus, it was the start of our hometown. Well, there is a monument to him on these grounds, or here at these grounds, Alan Denny is not buried here. He returned to his home state of New York in 1871 at the age of 81 after having lived here for 37 years and ultimately passed away there in New York 4 years later in 1875, where his mortal remains rest to this day, which leaves his cemetery that he started, his family cemetery, back here in Mokena. After Alan Denny left our environs, burials continued at this cemetery, but on a much more sporadic basis than before. And some graves over the years were even relocated to plots, family lots in St. John's Cemetery, which was much newer. And for the next couple decades, it seems like Mokena's churches used Denny Cemetery as a kind of potter's field where the poor were buried, or who otherwise had no family in this area, or who for whatever reason could not be buried in their churches' cemeteries. Little more cemetery history, which brings us to the matter of this historic cemetery's name. For decades, it was simply called Denny Cemetery, after the family whose property it sat on. And going forward for quite some time into the 20th century, a lot of people in town just kind of informally referred to it as the Old Cemetery. But finally, in 1939, right before World War II, it was christened Pioneer Memorial Cemetery by a local gentleman by the name of William Semler, who was the owner and publisher of the News Bulletin, which was our hometown newspaper, and a very influential figure in Mokena's history. We could do a whole tour just on his life. But ever since 1939, that name, Pioneer Cemetery, has stuck to this spot. The care of the cemetery has been a prickly issue over the years, to put it mildly. As far back as 1886, the village board was discussing how to keep the grounds in good shape. Well, 10 years later, in 1896, a Denny Cemetery Committee existed that cared for the burial ground, but next to nothing is known about what they actually did. What is clear is that after Alan Denny moved back to New York, the cemetery's condition deteriorated, and so it remained for many, many years. A 1909 account describes the place as having a heavy growth of locust trees, while further into the 1920s and 30s, it was described as being overgrown with a mass of weeds and being a real eyesore. I can show you a photo that was taken around 1917 by Mr. Semler, who I just mentioned, when he was just a reporter for the Joliet Herald News. This is Denny Cemetery around 1917. This photo was taken right over there, almost with the photographer being in Wolf Road, looking this way. And as you can see, they had kind of trimmed the foliage in this foreground area a little bit, but the weeds and the overgrowth back here are pretty intense, and like you can barely see any graves at all. So this was a real serious issue for a very long time in town. By 1910, a neighbor to the south who lived right over there even fenced in part of this cemetery and made it a chicken yard so his chickens could roam free. Nevertheless, the village board put an end to this. Later on in the 1920s, in an effort to clear the grounds, the jungle of overgrowth that existed here at the time, the Mokena Volunteer Fire Department even set the cemetery ablaze. An event that the News Bulletin described as a hot time in the city of the dead. In the second half of the 20th century, just about every volunteer group or nonprofit organization in Mokena had something to do with occasionally cleaning up the cemetery or looking after it. After a particularly long span of inattention, though, the Mokena Women's Club came along in 1996 and restored and beautified the cemetery, taking on the care of this hallowed place as an ongoing project that lasted all the way until 2024. a Mokena archaeologist by the name of Joe Sersnick helped put together lots of the historic gravestones, many of which by that time had been broken, scattered around. Well, a very great lady by the name of Carmen Smallwood spearheaded the Women's Club's efforts here. She got lots of help from her fellow ladies of the club and many other local volunteers, one of which was myself, this being the place that kindled my interest in Mokena history. So it's kind of like all where it started here for me was right here at Pioneer Cemetery. And then Pioneer Cemetery reached a huge honor in 2016 when it was finally made an official Will County Historic Landmark. There is, however, a big problem with Denny Cemetery, Pioneer Cemetery. So Alan Denny, who was the proprietor of the cemetery for decades, apparently never kept any kind of records as to who was buried here or who bought lots here. And if anything like this did exist, he probably took it back to New York with him when he moved, and it hasn't been seen since. There is also not a single piece of paper on file on the cemetery at the Will County Recorder's Office. There was a landmark watershed incident, we'll call it, that happened in 1939 that kind of changed everything. It was in that year that the Mokena Garden Club, as it existed back then, set out to change the landscape of the cemetery. And you'll remember how I described it in that area. Totally overgrown, a jungle, basically. They decided that the best thing to do that they came up with was to drag a road grader through the grounds, which is an implement that we don't really see anymore, but this is what a road grader looks like. This kind of thing right here with a big blade or plow on the bottom. They figured, it was probably pulled by some horses. They figured if it came through, it would just plow out all that overgrowth, have it be gone once and for all. And their hearts were in the right place. They really were. It plowed up the crazy overgrowth, the bramble bushes, the small trees, stuff like this, and got rid of them for good. But what it also did was uproot and damage a significant number of the gravestones here. And in the end, they didn't know where a lot of them went. And so the current locations of these gravestones in the cemetery are thought to only mark the approximate locations of the graves. And then to add to that, there were tons that they just, significantly more than are here nowadays, that they just didn't know what to do with. So they tossed them into a pile in the back of the cemetery that over time got smaller and smaller as people helped themselves to the gravestones as souvenirs. So because of this, the loss of all these original gravestones from the cemetery, we'll never know for sure everyone who's here. We can only go off of the gravestones that are still here and the scant clues that history has left us. This is Mokena's oldest landmark, as I was saying, but we'll never really know the full story. So to talk about some of the figures, some of the people that are here at Denny Cemetery, let's talk about Charles Denny again. He was the father of Alan Denny, the founder of Mokena, the founder of this cemetery. And he is buried in that vicinity over there, just to the right of that tree. He is believed to be the first person to have been buried here, along with his wife Lucinda, both of whom passed away in August 1839. And the fact that Charles is here in our cemetery is what really puts Mokena on the map, because he is only one of 4 Revolutionary War veterans to be buried in Will County. He is the oldest man that we know of to be here. He was born Christmas Day, 1759 in Pauldingstown, Dutchess County, New York. And during the War for Independence, he served at least 4 separate stints in the New York militia when he was basically still a kid. And in later years, he would tell stories of not only having seen Benedict Arnold, but also George Washington, General Washington, while he was serving, Charles was serving at West Point, New York. In 1838, Charles and Lucinda Denny, who were pretty elderly at that time, came west to what would later be Mokena to be closer to their son, Alan, who we talked about, and some of some of their other adult children who lived in the area. And when Charles died August 6th of the next year, he was almost 80 years old, which was pretty good for 1839. Charles Denny's original gravestone is long lost, has disappeared. But the Louis Joliet chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, along with aforementioned Mokena reporter William Semler, were instrumental in erecting a new one in 1916, which was only a year before America entered World War I. It's the, how can I describe it from here? It's right over there. It's the tall and narrow, kind of dark grayish gravestone. That's the one that the Joliet chapter of the DAR erected. And in 1939, going forward a little bit, 100 years since Charles Denny passed, the General Dearborn chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, erected the other marker for him, which is that kind of short and chunky granite marker over there with the flag holder next to it and the flag. That was put up for him in 1939, which was a huge event in Mokena when it happened. And we have a picture of when it was dedicated. Let's see here. That's Mr. Semler of the Mokena News Bulletin standing next to it. He always took a big interest in the cemetery. He was the one that was instrumental in getting Charles Denny's grave remarked and naming the cemetery, so on and so forth. So it's only appropriate that we show a picture of him today too. So yeah, that's a little about Charles Denny. The Sons of the American Revolution erected a historical plaque back around 2018 or thereabouts, which is just over there, that goes into depth on Charles Denny's Revolutionary Service. That's pretty interesting. I didn't want to say anything, repeat anything that's already over there, but if you're interested, I definitely invite you to have a gander because it's some pretty interesting stuff. Somewhere in that vicinity over there is also buried Lysander Denny, who is the son of Charles Denny and the younger brother of Mokena's founder, Alan. He passed away in March of 1872 at the age of 74. And like his brother, he was one of the early residents of the Hickory Creek settlement and even built a sawmill powered by the creek as far back as 1834. Family lore had it that Lysander was a veteran of the War of 1812, like his brother Alan, and he would eventually go on to live in Joliet and finally near Spencer in New Lenox Township. He was laid to rest in his family cemetery in Mokena when he passed. And as is the case with his father, his original headstone, long gone, but we may still have his footstone in the cemetery. Over there, mostly buried, is a little stone about that big by about that wide, and you don't really see these anymore, but a footstone years ago would be something, there was a headstone and a footstone. Of course, the headstone at the head of the grave, and the footstone, which was much smaller, placed at the foot of the grave, and it usually would just have the initials of the deceased on there. Carmen Smallwood and I discovered that probably about 24 years ago, and it bears the letters LD. So it may be Lysander Denny, could also be his mother, Lucinda Denny, or Lucy Denny, Alan's wife, we don't know. But he's believed to be buried, all the Dennys in that vicinity over there, almost into Wolf Road. So if you want to go for a little walk, we can explore some of the other people that are here in little tidbits. So if you follow me, please. So here we have the grave of Truman Smith, and at the end of this bed here, Ira Smith. And you're probably wondering how I know who's graves these are, as they're very, very worn. Believe it or not, 20 plus years ago, when the Women's Club first started to take care of the grounds and I was helping with everything, a lot of these gravestones were still pretty legible back then. They have really significantly deteriorated in the past 20 or so years. I don't know if you could blame that on acid rain or what, but luckily I took photos of lots of them, so we kind of know who's who. But Truman and Ira Smith are, they're both children, two of the earliest people to be buried in this cemetery, having been interred within a few months of Charles Denny in 1839. They were both, as I said, were both children. Truman was just a little over a year old when he passed away, and Ira was 7 years old. Even though their last name was Smith, it begs the question of whether or not they were related to each other. They had different parents, as Truman was the son of John Smith, and Ira was the son of Rufus Smith. So maybe they could have been cousins. We probably won't ever know, but it's pretty tantalizing in that there was an early settler of what would become Frankfort Township in this time frame that was named Truman Smith. He was an adult who had come from Vermont. So maybe with such a unique name, you wonder if they were related somehow. Maybe he was their grandfather, but it's a mystery, and we'll probably never know. Something else that's pretty unique is that Truman Smith's gravestone had been looted from this cemetery at some point. Probably around the 1980s or thereabouts is when it was last known to be here, but in 1996 when the Women's Club came along, it was not here. But it was later returned to the cemetery by some unknown person in the middle of the night towards the end of the 1990s. It was quite a surprise when it turned up, believe me, but a really cool surprise too. If we can walk right over here for just a real quick second, we'll get to meet someone else that's pretty interesting. So allow me to introduce Sybil Bennett today. Sybil Bennett, loud car, is the oldest woman known to be in this cemetery, having been born in October 1762, which means that she lived in colonial America as a child. She was 81 when she passed in May 1844, which is before Mokena existed, before the railroad existed. Our current community would only have been a dream in the minds of our forefathers at that point. But other than the fact that she was the wife of Ephraim Bennett, nothing about her has survived the ages. We know next to nothing about Sybil Bennett. A few years later, 1850, the 1850 census recorded a Bennett family as having lived here in what would become the Mokena area, but whether or not they were her kin, there was some relation there. The common theme for today, we just don't know. It's a mystery. But let's see, who else do we have here? Okay. Oh, yeah, these are all good. Okay. So, once again, we'll go right back over kind of to this main row of graves here. In the sun, unfortunately. We'll get to meet a few more interesting people. In fact, some of my favorite figures from Mokena's history are over here, actually. So here we have, tragically, a couple more children. Frank Peters, and right here, Friedrich Reitz. Frank Peters passed away in 1858 at the age of 13, and Friedrich Reitz in 1860 at the age of 2. And both of their gravestones are written in German, which shows the strong German influence that existed in the Mokena of their day, and that would last for decades. Frank Peters' gravestone has some pretty unique symbolism, as it's kind of hard to see. This here is the top. This is the top of Frank Peters' gravestone. And what we have here, it's hard to see, but we have a hand right here plucking a rose. And what that represents is a life cut short. A life cut short. There's some interesting symbolism on some of the graves here. His marker, Frank Peters' marker, also has the dubious distinction of having been pilfered from the cemetery and later returned, just like Truman Smith, who we just met. It was recovered and stored in the village garage further down Wolf Road for a very long time before it made its way back here to the cemetery at the end of the 1990s. In 1939, a gravestone was looted from this cemetery and was found broken and laying in the intersection of Wolf and LaPorte roads. It bore the date 1860, which begs the question, maybe that was Friedrich Reitz, who died that year, as his gravestone is very small and easily carried away and had been broken at one point. So maybe that was him. Maybe he also had been stolen from the cemetery and returned. But you'll notice that's a common theme here in the history of Denny Cemetery, unfortunately. Lots of gravestones having been stolen and returned, and a lot never having been returned, unfortunately. But if we step just a few steps over this way, we'll meet some profoundly interesting people. The Atkins family. Betsy Atkins and John Atkins. And they were a lot like the Denny family. They were true pioneers. They were among the first non-native settlers to what would later be Mokena, having arrived here in 1834 with their family right after the Black Hawk War. Their lives were tough, as their first meal in Will County would later be remembered as having been bread and sour milk. And they also, John and Betsy, are pretty unique in that there's a photograph of them that exists. They are not only the oldest Mokenians to have ever been photographed, but also the only folks buried in this cemetery that we have a photo of. John and Betsy Atkins, real pioneers, holding what looks like a book and a letter, maybe, folded up piece of paper, something that was very important to them. Let's see here, we'll talk more about John and Betsy. The Atkinses were a very spiritual family, and later John and Betsy's descendants would say that John would not commune at the Lord's table with a Christian who hadn't been immersed, meaning someone who had been baptized. Like Alan Denny, John Atkins was involved in Underground Railroad activities here in Mokena and was said to have transported escaped slaves to Alan Denny's in the middle of the night in his wagon, and that he would cover them with hay so that if he encountered anybody along the way, they wouldn't see them in his wagon. As you remember, aiding slaves was illegal at the time, so that's why he did that. Both John and Betsy Atkins passed away within a week of each other in January 1864, so the Civil War is still going on at that point. They were both well into their 80s. Betsy's gravestone is original, but John's here, you notice it looks pretty different, was erected by the Women's Club in the 1990s. He did have an original gravestone. It cost about $50 back in 1864. It was quite a lot of money. It probably matched Betsy's, but disappeared years ago. The icon of an open book on Betsy's stone was one commonly found in 19th century cemeteries, and it represents the Bible. It would be on the grave of a very devout person, as Betsy was. This is a good place. Oh, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. When John Atkins passed away in 1864, his neighbor, Alan Denny, wrote a letter to the Chicago Tribune to announce his death. And the Tribune printed the letter, I'll read part of it to you, called him one of the old pioneers of Illinois, and said he was this is Alan Denny's words that made it into the paper, he was a just, upright, and philanthropic man, and has always been a kind friend to the poor and the sick of his neighborhood. So it sounds like he was a pretty good guy, John Atkins. But this is a good place to mention another member of John and Betsy's family who also occupies a very prominent place in Mokena's history, even though she isn't buried here. I kind of thought, should I talk about her or not? But she's such a big deal in our history, I can't not mention Julia Atkins, who put together our very first newspaper in 1852, the year Mokena was founded, when she was only 18 years old. And here's a picture of Julia that was taken a little later. It's kind of a dark picture, but you still can kind of tell what she looked like. That's Julia Atkins, the editress of our very first newspaper, the Mokena Star, back in 1852. To talk a little about Julia, there is only one issue of this paper that is known to exist. It's in the possession of the Mokena Library nowadays, and she wrote everything by hand on huge sheets of paper. And it was like a literary journal, actually, because there was news in it, but she mostly included short stories that she wrote and opinion pieces, stuff like that. It's a really cool document that gets you into the head of a Mokenian from 1852. It's absolutely awesome. And Julia was a highly intelligent person who read the New Testament in Greek every day and even went on to go to college at what is today Northwestern, which was very unusual for a girl in her time that she lived. She passed away in 1906 in Massachusetts. Also buried in this vicinity right over here are Julia's siblings and John and Betsy Atkins' grandchildren, Miranda, Philander, and William Penn Atkins. And, as you guessed it, William Penn Atkins, who is right here, stolen from the cemetery, later returned. That was in, let's see if I have that date here. Yeah, it was returned about 15 years ago. I remember that. That was pretty cool when that happened. But on another note, if you watch the 4th of July parade from this area every year, of course we got the parade, it's a big deal in Mokena. You'll remember how every year there's a group of girls that will stand in front of the cemetery before the parade starts and face the judge's stand, which is right across the street, and they sing the Star-Spangled Banner. And to me, it's very touching and very moving because, as I like to think it, they're singing it for John Atkins, for Alan Denny, for Lysander Denny, who all three are, well, Alan Denny isn't, but the other two are buried here, and they're veterans of the War of 1812, and the Star-Spangled Banner is a poem from the War of 1812. So I like to think they're doing it just for him. Or them, I should say. We've got a couple more we can still meet. If you follow me, please, we'll go just right over here, over by this big tree. We've got a few pretty interesting ones over here. Behold, this is the grave of Barbara Scheffer, who is another early one in Denny Cemetery. She passed in September 1846 at the age of 80, which would make her born in about 1766. She's another one of those people who knew life in colonial America, knew life in America before the American Revolution. Nothing to sneeze at. You don't come across too many of those in this area. And then on the other side of the tree over here, we have a family plot. Here is the plot of the family of Hans Reimers Andresen, or as he would have said his own name in German, Andresen. Here is the gravestone of his first wife, Abel Katharina Andresen, who was born a Heukmüller or Hickmüller in today's northern Germany, like her husband. And the family came to our neck of the woods from there in June 1855. So by the standards of people here in this cemetery, newcomers. The Andresens were farmers on some property in the far southern portion of Orland Township in what is now 108th Avenue that stayed in their family for generations, for a very long time actually. And there's a lot of tragedy here. As two of Hans and Abel's children, an infant boy named Hans Jr. and a little girl named Anne or Anna, are here too, having passed in 1859 and 1863 respectively. Little Anna died in a fire when her dress started ablaze from a wood-burning stove. The same year she died, her mother Abel also departed. There's a mistake. There's a gravestone, a little one right over here that the Women's Club erected in the 90s. The year is off by a couple years, but via church records, we've been able to determine that Abel died in 1863, and she was either 34 or 44 when she died. And on her gravestone right here, once again, it's kind of hard to see, but you'll see this is a hand with a finger pointing up like this, and that symbolizes the ascension into heaven of the deceased. Excuse me. Eventually, Hans Andresen married Abel's older sister, Katharina, who passed away from dropsy in 1884 and is also buried in this plot. Hans himself, Hans Andresen, is not here, however. He lived to be quite old, having died in 1911 at the age of 88 and is buried in Homer Township. And interestingly, there are still members of this family that live in the area. So they're still out there. Let's see here. All right, we've got one more, one piece of interesting history and one more person to meet. So once again, we're kind of crisscrossing, going everywhere here today, but we'll go right over here, kind of almost to where we were when we first started. Which brings us to this weird thing. This was manufactured by Mokena concrete man Julius Oswald in 1940 and is not a gravestone. It was built to support the barrel of a French 75mm artillery piece from World War I. It was procured, it was just the barrel of the artillery. This was not here at the time, this eagle. This was put here by the Women's Club in the 90s. The French piece was acquired by the old Mokena Civic Association to honor the veterans buried here. However, when they put it up, they had really bad timing, because this is 1940. Mokena and the country were a year away from entering World War II, and during the war, the barrel was taken off, was removed, and used in scrap drives. So it really was not here very long at all. But after the war, about 1948, 3 years after the war ended, the Civic Association was given the current artillery piece over there as something like a payback for this one having been taken. And while we're talking about martial things, military things, this is a good place to kind of talk about our last personage we can meet today, a gentleman by the name of Abram Evans. Or sometimes his last name was recorded as Evans, but I think it was probably Evans, who was one of the last people to be buried here in this cemetery. And he passed in March 1896 at the age of about 66. And appears to have been buried at the expense of the township. His gravestone, if he ever even had one, is long gone, and we don't know where exactly in these grounds he reposes. But his claim to fame is that he was a Civil War veteran, one of the many buried in Mokena, and the only one that we know of to be buried here in Denny Cemetery. He was a New Yorker, and hailed from the area of Elmira in the southern part of the state. Interestingly, New York, that state, furnished more men per capita to the Union Army during the Civil War than any northern state, and Abram was one of them. He volunteered for duty in the 50th New York Engineers the year the war started in 1861 and served 3 years for President Lincoln. The regiment saw some of the hardest service of the war, including at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia in December 1862, which was a monumental disaster for the Union Army. Here is a picture, well, not a picture, but an artist depiction of the Battle of Fredericksburg. Whoops. Yeah, let's turn this off. We're almost done anyway. This is the artist depiction of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and the reason I chose this image was because Abram Evans was an engineer. They built things. And here what we see are Union men building pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock River to get into the city of Fredericksburg, the town of Fredericksburg, during the battle. All the while, they were under fire and suffering huge casualties. So this would have been something that would have been very familiar, would have been part of Abram Evans's memories, who's buried here. That wraps us up. So yeah, thanks for coming out. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Were there? Yes, Lana. Oh, go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank Joann Jeffers, part of Mokena Women's Club, who was involved in a lot of all this renovation and
Yeah, definitely.
headstone finding and all that stuff.
Yeah.
We had fun.
It was great. I loved doing it. Yeah. I remember very well.
And also, do you know why he picked Mokena as the name?
Oh, that's a very good question. So the question was, why did Alan Denny pick Mokena to name his subdivision when he platted it out back in 1852 when the railroad came? And I don't have a good answer for that. No one has ever known. No one knows if Alan Denny picked that name, if the railroad picked that name, because as the railroad was built, they said, okay, and then right here, we shall build a depot, and that's where Alan Denny was at the same time laying out his streets and his lots. The railroad could have named it, or it could have been an ancient name that the Potawatomi had already attached to this area at the time that was already here when the settlers got here. As we know, Mokena it's a corruption. I don't really like that word. The word Mokena is an interpretation of a Potawatomi word. Oh, thank you. Is an interpretation of a word that goes something like Mikinak, which means turtle in Potawatomi, or Algonquin, because that belongs to the Algonquin language family. So to answer your question, no, I don't know why the name Mokena was picked for this area, although there were several swampy bits of land in the area when the settlers first got here, so maybe there was something with a turtle that happened at some point. We don't know. Long answer.
It's mud turtle.
That's a misconception, actually.
Okay.
Yes, and I've been trying for years to steer people on this, but yeah, it does not mean mud turtle, it just means turtle. And I think I know where that came from. There was a historian in the 1960s by the name of Florence Pittman, who wrote with the Women's Club, I believe.
Story of Mokena.
Yeah, exactly. She wrote. Yeah,
Copyright to it.
That's right. She wrote. It's a very cool booklet about the history of Mokena. You can easily find it at the library. I don't know if that was ever put online. Do you know, Joann?
We're working on digitizing it right now,
Oh, okay.
and then it'll be available to everyone.
Okay, good. Florence Pittman told a story that Mokena was an ancient Potawatomi word that meant mud hole. Where she found this bit of information, I have no idea. She didn't make it up. It came from somewhere. But I kind of think that this turtle thing and the mud hole, I think they kind of morphed into one story over the years, and I think that's where that might have came from. Were there any other questions today? Yes.
Real fast one.
That's okay, yes.
So my mom lives in Gateway subdivision, like where all the mobile homes are. So is there a cemetery back in there?
Yes.
Yes, there is. Oh, I'm so glad you asked about that. Okay, so if you're familiar with Frankfort Township, if you go down Route 45 past south of Laraway Road, there's a subdivision called, or community, what have you, called Gateway, and they're like manufactured homes, modular homes. And just to the north of this subdivision is a kind of a big clump of woods, forest. In that wooded area is a cemetery that is about the same age as Pioneer Cemetery, a tad younger, just a tad younger. But there were there's very interesting history back there. A lot of old settlers buried back there. A lot of interesting gravestones. In fact, the gentleman, Mokena archaeologist who helped piece together and rebuild, as it were, a lot of the grave markers here in Pioneer Cemetery, worked to do a lot of that for that cemetery. It was called the Union Burial Society Cemetery, and I believe the oldest known grave in there was from 1848, and the oldest one here is 1839. But a few years ago, I used to go back there every year for Memorial Day because there's a Civil War veteran buried there whose grave I would decorate. And a few years ago, maybe more than a few, about 8 years ago maybe, the landowner put up a no trespassing sign. So I haven't been back there since then. And unfortunately, Mr. Sursnick, the gentleman that I mentioned, has since passed away. So I don't know if anybody's taking care of it. It might be totally overgrown again. But to answer your question, yes, Darnell, yes, there is a cemetery back there. And like Pioneer Cemetery, it's a Will County historic landmark.
Coming out, the Women's Club of Mokena has played a huge part in maintaining this and taking care of it. So I wanted to include both of you, just to talk a little bit about how the club has made it what it is today and kind of what's going on currently.
Wow. I think our interest began in about 1979 when Doris Sangmeister was aware of this being neglected, and she said it should be identified as a cemetery, but nowhere is there anything to identify it. So she went on a mission and created a committee, and they purchased the monument that's right here that identifies it as Pioneer Cemetery. So that's where it began. And early in the 90s, Carmen Smallwood had decided that perhaps we could consider it being a club project. I can't say we were overly enthusiastic in the beginning, because when we saw how devastating this whole location was, it seemed daunting. It just seemed like there's no way we can make a significant difference. But Carmen called together community meetings. She invited every organization, every church in town, the public to come. I don't remember how many meetings there were, several of them, to create a committee to research and renovate this. And Carmen spearheaded it throughout the entire process, along with Mr. Cernchuk, and they did an amazing job. Over the years, the Women's Club has spent countless hours here, weeding and doing whatever needed to be done. And along the way, we decided that we needed to create, because we couldn't determine exactly where any one person was buried, we created areas. And at one point in time, our club members, each one who wanted to participate in it, adopted an area, and they and their family maintained that area. Unfortunately, as of this spring, our Women's Club has decided that we're no longer able physically to maintain it. So we are hoping, beyond hope, especially with the exposure that Matt's presentation today might give, that there'd be a group, an organization, some families that might come forward and do the tasks of maintaining it, getting rid of the weeds, adding new mulch, and so on. So,
Matt,
hopefully.
you talked a lot about it in our tour, but where would this site be if it weren't for the Mokena Women's Club?
I don't even want to think about what it would be like. I remember when I was growing up, before the Women's Club maintained it, it was just pretty forlorn. There was no landscaping, there was no beautification. The stones were broken and laying flush with the ground. And it was just, they really changed everything. And I hope that can continue, but I will always associate the cemetery with the Women's Club, definitely.
And this year, I was down here for the Memorial Day ceremony, and it was probably the biggest crowd I'd seen at a Memorial Day ceremony down here. And awesome to see this place full. Great to hear, what the club has been doing over these years. So, anything else you want to, ask for? Tell what you guys.
Well, I would say that this would be a great project for people who like to garden. The village is cutting the grass, but it's still overgrown with weeds, and could add some flowers and nice shrubbery and things. So a garden group,
Okay.
which I won't mention, like Mokena Garden Club, which I'm in, needs to maybe get involved. It would be great if,
Bring in some community groups
Yeah,
and that to
absolutely.
take care of this. This is a real treasure, and for sure, we'd hate to see it, fall into disrepair, or even just to have it just being the grass cut. You see how that can get out of control too.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you both ladies for
Yeah,
coming
absolutely.
out. Great
Thanks
to
for
hear
coming
about
out.
the awesome part that your club has played over the years to get it where it is, and hopefully the community can come together and keep it beautiful.